Hello, everybody, and welcome back to this session of the University of Arizona Mining Law Summit. Today, we are going to be talking about the use of technology, social media, and research on the impacts of new mine technologies to respond to community concerns. And we are so excited to have our panelists here today. First, we have Flaviano Bianchini, who is the founder and executive director of Source International, an organization that brings capacity building and scientific support to communities who face human rights and environmental issues with a focus on the extractives industries. Flaviano's work with Source International has focused on projects in Guatemala, Honduras, Mexico, Mongolia, Indonesia, Mozambique, India, and beyond. Source International projects often involve use of innovative, affordable technologies and trainings for communities to aid in community measurements of air and water quality and documentation of findings. Next, we have with us today Trevor Jones, who is the founder and CEO of Lynx Global Intelligence, a software as a service platform that provides risk data to companies and investors. His background includes research focusing on geopolitical risk and complex decision-making during humanitarian crisis. Lynx Global Intelligence helps clients on 3 continents mitigate risk to people and planet. And finally, here we have Isabelle Ramdoo, who is Deputy Director with the Intergovernmental Forum on Mining, Minerals, Metals, and Sustainable Development, and the International Institute for Sustainable Development Law and Policy Program. She provides strategic support to IGF member countries to optimize socioeconomic benefits from the mining sector. Thanks so much for being with us today.
So we'll kick off this panel with an interview with Flaviano, and then we'll continue the discussion with Isabelle and Trevor and get some of their reflections on our conversation with Flaviano. Flaviano, please give us a brief overview of how Source International uses technology to respond to community concerns in the mining sector.
Well, first of all, I think I should start a bit with my story somehow. So when I started working with communities affected by mining, what I realized that very often there was a complete lack of understanding between the mining companies, the community, and the government. And this is mostly because it was historical mistrust. Just bear in mind that I started working in Latin America, where the mining industry and the government has an historical mistrust with communities. And there was also a lack of knowledge. So it was easy for everybody to just pick whatever subject because the community didn't really know what was happening inside their territories. Imagine you're an indigenous community in the middle of the Amazon forest, and all of a sudden you have an open pit mine inside your territory. You have no idea what is that. And obviously you have no tools to know what is happening exactly to your territory, to your environment. And that's how Source International starts, with the idea of providing those communities with instruments, knowledge, and tools that they can use to understand what is happening inside their territories, to measure somehow the impact that mining can have on their communities, and from that, ask for better behavior from companies, compensation from governments or companies, and the respect of their rights, basically. During the year, we have developed several instruments and tools. The vast majority of them are very easy and basic, and even somehow old technologies, I would say. The point is not that much the innovative technology, is the innovative aspect is to give technology to people that never had access to that technology. Even a very simple pH meter, an instrument that measures the acidity of the water, that is being invented in the 20s, so a century ago, in the 20s of last century, even an instrument like that, which is super simple, and today people use it to measure the pH of their pool in their villas, but that's something that an indigenous community had never seen before, and they don't know how to use it, and they don't know what information that instrument can give to them. But that instrument, a simple instrument of $20 that people use to measure their pool, can be used to measure acid rock drainage, which is one of the main polluting aspects of mining, for example. And then, I mean, obviously, this is the most simple example, and we also use some more sophisticated instruments. But generally, I think the innovative aspect is to provide communities with this technology, and therefore the community can know what is happening inside their territories, and use this data that they have to open a dialogue with companies and mining companies, and with governments. And even if it sounds very simple, it is actually very simple, but it can have a huge effect, because imagine the situation of a community that doesn't have any access to information, and therefore the mining company can tell them that they are the best all over the world, even if they are polluting, and the government can tell them whatever, and they don't really know. But if they have the access to this technology, they can measure what is happening. And from there, they can start negotiating, they can start demanding and asking for the respect of their rights. And we have examples of community in Mexico where they were able to obtain $50 million compensation from a mining company because they were able to measure scientifically the pollution that this company was causing. And I think this aspect on the long run, it's even more powerful, because if we can create a world where all the communities can monitor all the companies inside their territories, then companies will be somehow forced and driven to behave differently, to respect communities.
Thank you. Are there any other examples of the projects that Source International has done that have effectively utilized technology to advance community objectives?
Oh yes, there are many. In Peru, for example, in the city of Cerro de Pasco, we have obtained a declaration of emergency, of environmental emergency of the city, and the first time, and then the declaration of health emergency of the city. We're talking about a city of 80,000 inhabitants, and there are remedies that is put in place after this declaration, and also like funds from the government in this case, to enable to mitigate the impact that the pollution was causing on the people of the city. And in that case, we have been using some bit more sophisticated technology too. We have been measuring also the dust with some small laser detection. We have done some also infrared analysis from satellite images. So, I mean, it's not always super simple, but I mean, there are plenty of cases in which they were, the community itself, able to measure and obtain, therefore, compensation or remedies. In Mozambique, we have been installed all around the small villages close to a coal mine. We have been installed a series of instruments to measure the PM10 and PM2.5, so the coal dust pollution from the mine, and we have been able to open up a negotiation table between the mining company and the community with the participation of the government and the United Nations in that case as a mitigator. In that case, we have been combining these instruments that are actually a bit complicated with laser measuring precisely the PM10 and PM2.5 with a very simple community mapping, which is a small disc of cotton where we have put Vaseline on top, so the coal dust just get glued to it. So we put those discs all in the same days all around the community at different distances from the mine. And then a month later, we just took pictures of all those places, and we measure where the coal deposit more and where less. which is obviously not high technology, but it's something that a community can do, and for 0.12 cents of dollar. That was the average price of the entire, for every measurement plate. So even a farmer community in Mozambique was able to do it.
Thank you for those examples.
Great, thank you so much, Flaviano. And looking at these technologies that you've been referencing and speaking about, we are seeing mining companies bring on new innovative technologies that may have positive benefits, such as decreased water use and lower carbon emissions, and others, such as advances in automation, that may increase efficiency and increase worker safety, but it may also drastically reduce the need for a local workforce. What have you heard from communities where you've worked with Source International about changes in mining technology and the impacts on their lives and communities?
This is a very difficult question. I mean, that's a difficult answer, actually. There is, as you said, there are mining that, especially the old mining, the old mines that has been reconverted with new technologies, where local communities were used to have 6,000 or 7,000 employees, and nowadays they have 300. And of which 150 are engineers, so not from the community. And that obviously, it creates a lot of concern because those communities need those jobs. But at the same time, I think it should be, there should be a transition into the economy too. So those new technology that the mine is using to extract, they can use more workforce to reduce pollution, for example, for mitigation, and obviously there's also the concern of pollution in the community. So it's a balance somehow. And in theory, what I think is that for those old mines, the money that they have generated when there were a lot of employees, they should now be used either by the government or by the company itself to redesign new jobs, basically, and possibly in different sectors. So also diversified economies, because it's not 100% sure that having 6,000 employees on a 30,000 inhabitants community is good for the economy. Actually, it might get a boost at the beginning, but then it's very fragile. And especially because they are pretty much linked to the price of raw material, that they can fluctuate quite a lot. In terms of new technology, there is also, I think, it's true, mining companies are reducing pollution in a lot of cases. It's not always the case all over the world. This is something that might be mentioned, because what those new technologies can be used in the United States, in Canada, in Europe, they are not used then in Mozambique, in Guatemala, or in Mongolia. A clear example is, for example, copper extraction, which in the United States is mostly now there's a growing extraction system with bacteria, but if you go to Latin America, they're still using sulfuric acid, which it's highly pollutant. Same with the new technology of closed cyanide for gold extraction. So the closed cyanide process are now a law in Europe and in the United States and Canada. But then if you go to Guatemala, all the gold mines of Guatemala, which are quite a lot, they use open cyanide. And there is a balance, because most of the companies and most of the people say, well, we respect laws. I mean, the government does not oblige us to use a closed mechanism. So, I mean, we comply with local law. And I remember I was in quite a few times ago in a conference in Miami with Kofi Annan, and Kofi Annan said, a mining company doesn't need a law to know that they don't have to pollute the water of the village. So I think, and this is something that also should be considered, like new technologies that are available and that are used by companies, they must be used all over the world, even if the law does not require it. This, I think, is something that we should move in that direction.
Thank you so much for that, Flaviano. I think that you're absolutely right that it's time to be more strategic about this transition that we're looking at and making sure that we are integrating those long-term benefits into the communities with these mining projects. So thank you.
Flaviano, what types of technologies, whether it's scientific or communications or social media, do you think would most advance the objectives of communities as they navigate the impacts and benefits of mines?
I think it's pretty much everything. They definitely need technology to measure pollution. As I said before, they need to have tools to know what is happening inside their territories. They also need tools to communicate it, because what I always say, if you have data, but you cannot communicate those data to anybody, then those data are useless. And in that sense, it can be, social media can be, but I don't think social media is the panacea of everything. And actually, in a lot of cases, doesn't really work very effectively. In remote communities, for example, community radios are still pretty much way more effective than social media. If you go in the middle of the forest, the radio is the main communication tool. So there is something that I would say not everybody, but the majority of people are now having is a mobile phone. It's a smartphone. So we have been trying to work, for example, in using a smartphone as a measuring tool. So developing some app or something like that to use your smartphone in order to measure the pollution of the water somehow. It won't be super precise, but something that can work. The problem is that obviously apps need a market to be developed, because you need to pay to do the apps, to do the apps, to the engineers, the informatics, and everything. And there's no market for those things, because obviously if the app would be a paid app, nobody will buy, and nobody will never put advertisement on an app for measuring water pollution. I think there is a potential there. So if I would have invested now, I think that's probably, I think it's the sector that I think is still, it is useful, but at the same time, it's not as much developed as it could be. Because in terms of like proper analytical technology, we have plenty. I mean, plenty. We have been to the moon 60 years ago, and you know, what's the problem of measuring water pollution? We were able to do that 150 years ago. There's plenty of technology and cheap technology. So the point is to put this technology in the right hands. And in terms of communication, it's not always easy. And the problem with social media is that there is a lot of noise. Noise as a scientific terms of noise. So when you have a lot of background noise, and then you cannot really hear what is important. So it's hard sometimes to just, put out the news. But there is, from traditional media also, there is a bit of more attention, a bit more focus recently over those issues. So I think there is improvement also there.
Thank you. I'll turn it over to Ashley to wrap us up.
Yes, absolutely. So, in these last few moments here, Flaviano, You mentioned radios and other communication challenges that may arise in remote communities. In this era of COVID-19 and seeing the huge shift to online virtual meetings, but often not having an accessible platform for remote communities near mineral developments, how has your work continued to work with communities through this pandemic to address some of those issues? Thank you.
It has been hard, and you're totally right. It's not easy to communicate with local communities. They don't have a proper connection. They don't have 4G, 5Gs, or a Wi-Fi connection, and it's super hard to keep the communication from remote. For us, we are trying to communicate mostly with the leaders of the community that normally they have, a smartphone and maybe they can connect to Zoom or to any other platform, and then try to empower them to then work more with the community. But it's very hard. We were used to work directly with the community, and it's a completely different thing. And it's also very difficult for us because all the measurements, it's hard to explain. I have an instrument and I have to teach you how to use the instrument. I'm there and give you the instrument, and it's easy. If I'm here and try to explain you with the same instrument from the computer with maybe a connection with very low quality of video and that maybe breaks every 2 minutes, it's super hard. But that's what we have to do so far, and just hanging on for better moments, I assume.
Great. And over to Christy for any closing comments.
Well, I think in closing, is there any key guidance that you would offer to mining companies and other stakeholders who are participating today that are takeaways from Source International's work to use technology to support communities?
I think if I have to say one takeaway, one guidance is engage the community. Engage them, and citizen science is a big issue. Is actually there is a movement to add the citizen science as one of the sustainable development goals, to just bring it as important as it is, and just engage them, do citizen science, build the capacity, because that what will open the table for dialogue. That will open the mutual understanding of all the actors, which are mainly 3: governments, companies, and communities, and start the conversation. Unfortunately, very often we see that of those 3 actors, there is company and government speaking by them and keeping the community outside. And it's awful, because also then the reaction of the community that feel excluded is very often a confrontive reaction, obviously. And that what happens is that they rise up and conflicts generation and all the problem that can generate from them.
Well, thank you so much for taking time to share your experience and expertise and the work of Source International. We really appreciate it.
Thanks to all of you. Thank you.
You're most welcome. Okay, well, a lot of topics came up in that very informative video conversation with Flaviano. And I'm wondering, Isabelle and Trevor, what are your initial reactions to the information that Flaviano shared and the experience of Source International?
I think this was absolutely fascinating. I mean, to me, it really underscores the power of knowledge and the power of sharing that knowledge. And I think data, new technologies, is really taking the conversation to a different level. I think 5-10 years ago, we would have kind of expected things to come, like we say, through the grapevine. And now this is real-time information, real-time data. It's evidence-based, and it's very hard to go around it if people are informed. I think this is really important, the power of knowledge, the power of information, and the power of making this information known and using it. I think to me, this is what I really got from that conversation. I found it really interesting. And I think a lot of what he said will probably come up in the comments that we will make, but just one thing I wanted to highlight is the last point he talked about partnerships and how you engage with communities and the way you engage with communities. I think it's kind of flipping the conversation over to what previously people were calling it a paternalistic conversation, where mining will tell communities what to do or will think for the communities. And now the fact that the communities have some of that information, the conversation becomes much more, I don't want to say balanced, because there is, the power relation is still very skewed, but you kind of see that data and information is bringing this balance a little bit less skewed than what it was.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah,
Trevor,
absolutely.
any thoughts you'd like to add?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, we talk a lot about at Links about the empathic space in between the companies and the community, right? And so you can tell by the way Flaviano talks about some of these things that he's been on the ground with the communities in that kind of space between enterprise and what's going on socially and environmentally. And I definitely have some comments a little bit downstream about some of the technologies he mentioned and really how to aggregate them into one platform so we can kind of give both the community and the company the tools they need to kind of create that space in between. And I think it was interesting that, you know, he said that the app needs a market. And if you look at the market, I mean, the mining companies, like you said, Isabelle, they're big and powerful. They got a lot of money. So, you know, they are the market for this technology. And so if you can get them to create this space with that technology, it's just really cool. So I have a deep respect for what his company's doing. And oh my gosh, the innovation with the Vaseline and the coal dust, that's a sensor we never would have thought of at Lynx. So very, very cool.
Yeah,
stuff.
sometimes the best technologies for communities can be the most simple.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, he mentioned how cheap some of these sensors are, right? So there really is no cost prohibition to going around a Peru or a Mozambique, putting some of these sensors in the ground and then giving that info to who needs it. So it's cool stuff, deep respect for his work. I can't wait to reach out to him to understand too how they're tackling some of these things.
Great.
Thank you so much, Isabelle and Trevor, for those insights there. Trevor, we'd love to hear more about your work. Please give us a brief overview of how Lynx Global collects and uses publicly available data, including from social media sources, to monitor risks to a mining company's social license to operate, which we all know is a big trending topic these days.
Yeah, absolutely. And as Flaviano mentioned, it's kind of about connecting those environmental grievances and measuring the ground truth of what's going on to that social license and kind of the behaviors and perceptions and side communities so we can try and create that buy-in and a lot of security and human dignity for people. But the way we try to go about that is really as a data aggregator. So we quickly realized that rather than running around the world, putting sensors in the ground and kind of creating data, that there's plenty of data around us at all times for all of these problem sets. So what we do is we essentially create a weighted algorithm for social license, and it takes into account things like security, which, you know, in Mozambique, for example, you know, really kind of nascent emergent security issues, a lot of terrorism that has come about even just in the last year, right? So we want to make sure that we're getting that security data. Kind of as a base level, hard to create economic prosperity and human dignity when there's no security, right? So then we move on to the social piece where we're gathering from social media and actually working on some of the same data sets that Flaviano mentioned. So the SMS text, right? Not everybody in the world has, you know, a computer and an internet connection, but almost everybody has a phone right in their hand, whether that's a smartphone or a dumb phone, right? So we can kind of send those SMS surveys out and start to take a look at that piece. So The way social media, I will say, comes into play is when these social issues snowball into a global reputational issue. And we've seen that for some of our clients, and honestly, that's great incentive to kind of get that company leg of that three-legged stool to kind of pay attention to some of the reputational issues and stemming from social license. So it really is just an amalgamation or aggregation of open source data sets that come from institutions, academia, social media data sets, news, blogs, Reddit, YouTube, certainly working on the local radio issue because tons of opportunity in terms of translating into English and then into text and then disseminating that information amongst stakeholders. And so, yeah, we have 4 or 5 kind of subcategories we pull from. The last one I'll mention is kind of new data sets like satellite, GPS for trucks. We mentioned dust coming off the trucks and communities as well. And then Internet of Things would be the final one, the sensors in the ground. So that's a wide range of data sets, but that's really the point, is to collect and aggregate this info so it's super usable and easy to understand for both the community and the enterprise.
Fantastic. And you've already touched on this a bit. Can you provide us with some examples of how mining companies in particular have used the data from your platform to identify and then respond to community concerns?
Sure, I'll use a high-level example, and of course I have to be a bit general because of the sensitivities, right, frankly, between the community and the enterprise in a lot of these situations, particularly the community, of course. But in Eastern Europe, we had a situation where one of our clients had a $200 million investment and kind of a well-known mine and an older operation. This was in an area where it had been a Soviet spa town. The respect for the water purity in this area and a lot of the other environmental factors was really, really high. And as it turned out, our client had done a lot of stakeholder engagement, a lot of kind of interaction with the community. But we were able to use our technology to kind of trace some of those grievance strains, right, down to what the individual grievances were. And certainly the water piece was huge. And we also find out things like livestock, right, where herders are able to put their cows when mining concessions or, exploration comes in. These little things, right, can trickle or snowball, I should say, into really large grievances. And this particular mine suffered some pretty significant reputational risk and discontinuity issues as a result. So that's a lose-lose for everybody, right? So, again, create that empathic space, get the data, represent it in a way that both the community and the companies can understand and use to try and help out.
Great. Thanks, Trevor.
Thank you.
Isabelle, let's turn to your fascinating research on the topic of mining technology. Please tell us more about the New Tech, New Deal project and its approach to understanding impacts of new mining technologies on sustainable development.
Yeah, thanks. This is indeed a really fascinating stream of work that has kind of grown out organically from one of our annual general meetings we had a couple of years ago. At that meeting, we were discussing a number of issues, and we had discussions going on in parallel rooms, right? In one room, there was a great discussion about a document that I was involved in, like we had a guidance document on local content policies, and governments were talking about how best to design local content strategies and policies to get the most of employment and jobs and the most of procurement and to add value downstream. So the discussion was really focused on, how can you get the most out of policies? How can you design policies? At the same time, in another room, there was another extremely fascinating discussion, this time led by industries. And the conversation there was about the new technologies that were being deployed to make the mines greener, smarter, more efficient. And the discussion was about trends in innovation and how that would change the face of the mines in the next couple of years. What struck us in those two conversations were the disconnect between them. While governments were busy designing nice, fancy policies, regulatory frameworks to mandate, basically to force companies to recruit more local people, to buy more local goods and services, they were completely missing the fact that the industry was changing, that, you know, some of the technologies would completely wipe out the jobs that they were forcing companies to recruit. And the same for procurement. And they were also really missing the fact that that was happening super fast. So, you know, Flaviano was mentioning something earlier. He said, yeah, but we see those technologies coming very fast in Canada. Today, the first fully turnkey automated project happened in Mali. Among all places. And there is another one by the same company in DRC. So this is not something that is a fiction for developing countries. It is real. And many governments actually don't really realize that. That was the first thing. The second thing on the other side, similarly, you know, the industry was busy talking about fantastic processes, how to improve them, how to make them more efficient, more competitive. And of course, if you don't do this, you go out of business. But they were not speaking to public authorities, and they were not telling to public authorities what kinds of skills they will need, because jobs, not all the jobs will disappear. I mean, there will still be opportunities, but the opportunities will be completely different. The kind of jobs that you have today in low-income countries is relatively low skill. The opportunities, at least at the mine phase, what the new mines will require is something completely different. And you need to manage this transition from one to the other, because technology won't happen at the same time, at the same space across all economic sectors. So in developing countries, what the mine is able to do, maybe the manufacturing sector or the ag sector is not doing at the same pace. It will happen, but it's not all kind of sync. So there is a need to do this transition. So this is how our project came about. So we realized there was a big gap to be filled there because the governments were setting themselves up for failure if they didn't understand what trends were coming up and designing policies that would work, not work. And there would be frustration there because the more they think it's not working, the more they try to regulate and the more they impose penalties. And that's what you see now in local content policies. And companies were setting themselves up also for disaster because they were not speaking to governments. And flip side is that at their face, they have communities being super, anxious about the future of their jobs because they don't know what will happen. There's no training, there's no reskilling, there's no plans. So that kind of two things we needed. IGF IGF, part of the work that we do, we provide guidance to government, but we also facilitate the conversation among various types of stakeholders to try to find an approach for things to improve. So that's how the project started. And we started with the first report that really basically tried to understand. The report was called Mining a Mirage. So basically what we looked at is we reassessed the shared value paradigm to try to find, in light of new technologies, what would happen. And it was relatively narrow, if you want, because it was a first assessment. We focused on automation and we focused on jobs. And we kind of created scenarios, a 30% cut in employment, 50% and 70%, and tried to kind of simulate what could happen. None of that was based on evidence data from companies. It was hypothetical scenarios just for governments to understand, if you don't do this, what could happen? And then, of course, that was the first kick in the door, and it was scary. And we got really a lot of, questions from people saying, yeah, but, we really need to get evidence out of this. And then we decided to go deeper, and that's where we are now. We have a 2-year project that is funded by GIZ that is this time trying to go deeper to understand what technologies are really coming in the broad sense. What we did in the first phase of this work, we mapped the technologies coming to really understand, because if you want to understand the impact, you have to understand what you're talking about. There are different types of technologies. Some might be positive. We were talking about sensors, data-driven technologies, and there are things like automation. Impact is completely different. You've got things like green technology that can be really enhancing if local communities have access to green energy to water, etc. So there are some. So what we did, we mapped them, we categorized them in 5 groups, a taxonomy, and then we looked at what impact those technologies would have on things like gender, things like jobs. So of course, the study kind of looks at impact on really context specifically. We didn't want to put a number this time because the numbers don't really make sense. Things change so fast that the number become completely irrelevant. What we try to understand is, how do you do this when those changes happen? So yeah, the report is available online, and it provides you with a kind of good mapping of what is coming up, what are the potential impact. We indeed focused a lot on skills and the skills of the future, because that came out as something particularly striking when it comes to the impact at the local level. It's jobs and it's procurement. The other things are important, but in the short to medium term, those were the main issues that we looked at. And we also looked at what are the new, how can you think about social investments in a more innovative way, just to use the word technology, but to think differently, things like the way you look at CSR strategies they are now. I think to me, this is a bit of a stale model because it looks at things. CSR is cyclical. The first thing that gets cut when the price of commodities go down is the CSR budget. What is left is the little crumb that you can get. What we're trying to see whether we are able to build in a little bit what the ESG debate is about, building more impact right from the start when you design an investment project, when you're designing it, or if you're already in an operation phase, how do you rethink your social investment to drive more impact? It's more sustainable, it's a more virtuous model. And it kind of brings in the community to the table when you discuss and you negotiate that. So we looked a bit at a very first cut at those kind of things. And now in the second phase, we're going deeper. We're doing 5 case studies. We're looking at South Africa, DR Congo, Burkina Faso, Chile, and Mongolia. And we're getting deeper into those country-specific realities, and see how we can, what we can learn from this so that governments can improve their policies moving forward. So that's where we are in terms of the analysis and the study.
Terrific. I'm wondering if your study has any key findings about how advances in automation may increase opportunities for women in the mining sector and help advance gender equality. Does your research support this?
Yeah, so of course, when you look, I just wanted to say that when we glance, I don't want to see look in this particular phase because this is something we're doing now. When we glance at the gender impact, we actually realize that men will be more affected than women because they are in larger number, right? So because they are larger share, they will be more impacted, and because they're employed in physical and manual jobs that will disappear. Whereas the women that we have today in the industry, they are more at the administrative level, they're in the office, not necessarily at the mine phase. Their jobs are also at risk, but those are jobs that you could, I don't want to use the word easy because there's no easy transition, but administrative jobs are more easily transferable elsewhere in other economic sectors. An accountant that gets wiped out because of blockchain can become an accountant in an SME that is still there. So that is one thing that kind of struck us in the structure of the way the gender balance is in the industry at that particular moment. That said, you're right, there will be new opportunities with new technologies for women. The major issue that we had, and those will probably be in higher skill position and, in HQs, in more modern operating, remote operations in capital cities, not necessarily at the mine phase. The main challenge that we face there is data. There's no data. So we have no idea today how many women are employed in the large scale mining sector. Our project don't focus on ASM, it focuses in large scale. very hard to get a clear exact numbers of how many women are employed, except from some anecdotal evidence from countries like South Africa, Australia, Canada. Even the ILO doesn't have any detailed background breakdown of direct employment of women at the mine, let alone if you want to look at it from a supply chain perspective. How many women own a business that supply the mine or work in a sector that supply the mine? Zero. Data doesn't exist at breakdown level. And neither are they by occupation or by country. So this was super hard, to try to see what will happen next if you don't know what the state of play is. The other thing that was hard to get is assessment of the conditions of work and salaries. We know very well that, high level, that the salaries are not the same. How much? We have no clue. So all this to say that we are now working on a new research work stream with International Women in Mining, Columbia Center for Sustainable Investment, the ILO, and other stakeholders who are able to provide us with this baseline analysis. Because as long as you don't understand what the state of play is, you are not able to project yourself in the future. Yes, there are opportunities, we know high level, but I cannot tell you now, looking at what the technologies are coming, what those opportunities will be, and how can you empower them? What are the skills? We don't know what is the skills gap today for mining jobs for women at the mine site. We have no idea. So just to say that, yeah, this is really a critical issue that we'll be looking at. And I think if everything goes well, by sometimes mid next year, we should have some findings, and then we will map that with the work that we're doing on the future of technology.
Thank you so much, Isabelle.
Thank you, Isabelle. I love hearing that you guys are doing all this work on gender equality and getting those really accurate data sets. So thank you guys for all that. And we're looking forward to seeing the results of the study. Now here's a question for you both. As we asked Flaviano earlier, what types of new technologies in science, social media, communications, or otherwise, do you think would best advance the objectives of communities as they navigate the impacts and the benefits of mines?
Yeah, Isabelle, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I can. I think Flaviano said very clearly, it's a bunch of different types of technologies. I think it's not just one technology. What really, there are some obvious one, of course, when you look at high-speed connectivity, digital infrastructure, clean technologies. Those are obvious technologies that can have direct impact in communities. But I think there are others that are less obvious. And I think that those that have multiple uses are, to me, the ones that are the most interesting to look at. We talk about things like sensor technologies. You were talking, Trevor, about apps and connected. Things like this have wider application. What we've seen, for example, when we were looking at alternative livelihoods, because one of the challenge of doing the transition away from large number of jobs, or relatively large number of jobs, because mines are capital intensive, but for communities it matters, right? So if you're moving from 3,000 jobs to 5,000 jobs, what do you do with 2,500 people? You need to find an alternative livelihood. And very often this will not be in the mine, it has to be somewhere else. So the technology challenge, actually, that seems a challenge for communities. Some of those can actually be part of the solution for them if you are able to provide them to other economic sectors. You were talking about livestock. We've seen, for example, in countries like Kenya, people were using their apps to look at the weather forecast and look at the commodity prices on the stock market for livestock. And they are able to plan their agricultural practices. The other thing that is very important, I think Flaviano was referring to this, is those technologies that are able to get you pH of water and quality of air, quality, the temperature. This is very powerful if you're able to map that with agriculture or some other economic activities. You can plan your season, agricultural season, if how some of those things look like. And to me, this is what is interesting. How do you adapt some of those same drones, for example. You're
Sure.
able to use a drone to bring, blood to a hospital 200 kilometers away,
Sure.
just because the drone flies straight and there's no road, right?
Yeah.
And those things, the industry are buying them. The mining industry is investing. It's not like it's a completely different technology. You need to adapt it. So to me, there is a conversation to be had there with the industry to see, and that's what I was talking earlier about new social investments. Those social investments are not pet projects like let's build a hospital and a school. It's how do I use some of my technology and invest the same or some of the same. When I buy drones, I can buy, I'm just giving an anecdotal evidence like that. I'm buying drones for myself. Maybe there are a bunch of drones that I can buy in partnership with whatever cooperative somewhere there, because we think this can be used for whatever other economic project. And that's where I think there is a scope to mutualize opportunities across economic sectors, so that you do this alternative livelihood in a sustainable manner.
Yeah, no, absolutely, Isabelle. Thanks. Yeah, just and to piggyback off a couple of things you said, and to tie in an earlier notion, this idea that automation will reduce the number of jobs. It will reduce a certain number of jobs, no doubt, inside the mine operationally, that have to do with taking the ore out of the ground. There's all kinds of other systems that will need to be, people will need to be trained on them. This technology and the knowledge can stay local. Drones are actually a great example. You can teach somebody to fly a drone in a couple of days, and all of a sudden they're using a GIS, geographic program systems program to start to create some of that interface we've talked about. So I tend to be on the optimistic side of that as a technologist. Maybe it's incumbent upon me to do that, but I do think that if we think about it in terms of opportunity, creating jobs, leaving knowledge and technology local, that could be a positive in our future. And I am optimistic about that. And then I'll say, without getting into the myriad kind of technology examples, I really think about it in terms of 3 or 4 categories. So there's internal data. The mines and the communities, for that matter, have all kinds of data on hand. It might be paper records, it might be stored in whatever format, but that's there, right? So we can start on a basic what exists already level. And we add some of this open source data. So that's 2, freely available data sets from World Bank or any of the institutions or great academic sources out there. You start to think about social sources, social media, SMS texts, surveys, these kinds of things. And then you think about the new stuff, right? Satellite, IoT sensors, GPS. So there's 4 categories, right? And anything in those 4 categories, we really believe, and we're kind of working on all of them to put them on our map. Anything that connects the community to that enterprise. So, we might have a chief risk officer sitting in Denver or Manhattan, and we have some community stakeholder engagement in Lima maybe, and then we have the asset itself. Well, these are spread out touch points and nodes in this network. So if that IoT sensor can show that the water pH is right, and the community agrees that the water is clean, how beautiful would that be that we can verify that ground truth, create some social license, try to create that buy-in, and then hopefully leave that labor and that knowledge and that technology local, right? Like we're talking about. So I think that's really our framework. And, a map is kind of the tool that we've decided is the thing that's, anybody knows what a map is around the world, right? Very few people don't recognize that. And so cognitively as a tool, that's what we've kind of settled on as the way we're going to bring all this info together, and what form that takes, whether it's, posters in the the town square, the community center, or, a very advanced kind of dashboard for our mining operators with some artificial intelligence in there. We'll see, but anything that in there that connects end to end to create that empathic space is really what we're about.
Can I add something? I was going to say, let's not forget about what the so-called old technologies, because when you are in a developing country, whatever 3G, 4G makes brilliant sense for a community that has no access at all. I think to me, there is a secondhand market that is completely unexplored. I was talking to this, if somebody has a brilliant, has money, doesn't know what to do, we've got some ideas on how to make them get rich. We develop with those secondhand technologies. Because I was talking to somebody who used to work for a mining company at some point in time. And we're talking about, what do you do with everything that is being removed because you're installing completely new things? Well, of course, not everything can be, reused, but some of those technologies can actually be sold for cheap. We were talking about something very simple as trucks. Trucks, if you put in, we're not talking about those 3-ton trucks, right, that you have in Pilbara. No, we're talking about the mid-sized trucks. And that guy was telling me that in countries like South Africa, for example, in communities where the waste is not being collected just because there's no infrastructure, those trucks are sitting somewhere rotting because nobody wants to take them away. And he said, the mining industry is even ready to pay you to take away that waste. So we shouldn't forget about that secondhand market of some of those technologies. Somebody has to sit and think about we're looking at what's coming. We're not looking at what is become redundant, so to speak, because the new things are coming. And I'm sure we can unpack a lot out of that.
Yeah, Isabelle, you really have my wheels turning. I mean, as Flaviano said earlier, the radio piece, right? Radio dominates still in most of the world. And so I'm even thinking of service level businesses where you could have social license and environmental services and advocates that are jumping on the radio, disseminating information to the community. And I will, add a gender-based note as the only man on the panel here, is that, I think if we look at social license and some of the environmental grievance pieces, if we don't know how many women are in the workforce, then we definitely don't know the, perceptual and behavioral effects that women have for social license and environmental grievances that drive those license. And, there's been some really interesting research, especially coming out of places like the Middle East, that show what we know about those networks on the outside from our perspective is completely different than what's on the ground. And women wind up being the decision makers and some of those focus nodes that really need to go in that network to achieve social license. So information like that and trying to provide a service level business that incorporates both that environmental, social, and even a gender lens, I think would be really, really great. I mean, it's unexplored. It's totally a blue ocean strategy. And I agree with you, those that take the risk to invest in these kinds of technologies, given the fact that mining's not going away anytime soon, that's a great opportunity out there. So.
Thank you both so much. In the last few minutes of this panel, as we go into your closing thoughts, I'd love to know if you have anything else you would like to share in response to your co-panelists. And in particular, if you have any closing thoughts about how companies can better use technology to serve communities through the COVID-19 pandemic.
Yeah, I think I'll combine both, because both Trevor and Flaviano kind of really touched on the tech side of things. I'm more from a policy side of things, even if we see, what are the opportunities that technology can bring to governments in particular. It's not just only government, it's the collaboration between governments, industry, and communities. To me, this is really the sort of triple helix thing that we have to look at. It's really important. And there, I think, to me, this is really new thinking if we can bring this back to the decision-making table, because we've seen in the climate space how investors are telling to mining companies, or any companies for that matter, well, if you are not clean, we're not going to put money on your in your business. Even companies like BlackRock has said, if you don't tick the ESG boxes, we're not going to invest in you. So Anglo is divesting from coal. Everybody's running away from fossil fuels, basically because that's what the market is saying. Now, the new generation of investors that we have today, the millennials, those who are like in their 30s and 40s, they don't want to invest in anything that is not sustainable. And sustainable with a big S, we're talking about essentially sustainability there and how technology can serve sustainability of companies, sustainability of businesses, and sustainability of governments. Because at the end of the day, if none of that work, you have people in the street, riots, and that's it. So I think to me, it is really important to bring all those together and make sure that the conversation that is happening at the tech side not only includes community at the core of it, but that the government has to understand what is coming. To me, those who hold the regulatory pen could be the most dangerous. I'm trying to find a better word, but they are the one who are going to regulate tomorrow, and who are going to tell companies what to do and what not to do when they come. And if they are not convinced and they are not able to provide the right framework, because that's the whole thing. We were looking at countries to try to see how we can help them with new kind of supply chains, which will be different from the kind of supply chains today. The first thing that struck us, the IP, the intangibles, the new technology is full of all those intangibles. Nobody would invest in your country if you don't have an intellectual property right framework in the first place. People are not able to patent their innovation. You don't invest in R&D. So look at the number that the governments invest in R&D in developing countries. It's very low compared to China and the others, So that aspect of the regulatory framework is still very much far behind where the industry is, and let alone where the tech geeks are, which is I even find sometimes the mining industry very much backwards compared to many other sectors when it comes to tech. So now if you want to rank them, governments is really, really far behind. And to me, we really need to make sure that this kind of convergence happen, because otherwise the sustainability with a big S is completely at risk.
Yeah, absolutely. I just could not agree more, or could have said it better myself. I mean, I think we have an opportunity right now in the timing of things, because we're getting industry to catch up. We're getting regulatory frameworks to catch up. Now is really the time to develop this stuff, especially in terms of the tech enablement piece. One thing I will say is that as those millennial investors think about how to divest, right, from things that they don't consider clean, one paradox you'll find is that, as we reduce fossil fuel use, we really need more minerals, right? Because we're building more lithium batteries, we're building more solar panels. The battery technology has to advance. So you find yourself in this situation where may be good for everybody on the panel, but mining's not going away in our lifetime, and we need to achieve these social license and environmental standards. So it's refreshing, I think, just to meet everybody here, just that we're all working on this and kind of trying to attack this very specific problem, and yet one that, especially with social license and climate, extends to all kinds of other things. And you mentioned riots in the streets. When governments and enterprise lose their social license, it really is a lose-lose, right? We want to create clean, sustainable, dignified buy-in to some of these activities that we know we're going to need. And that's just going to be a win-win for everybody. So I feel lucky to work on it, and it's refreshing to meet everybody on the panel, including Flaviano. I'm just looking forward to kind of pursuing these things. Isabelle, I can't wait to follow up with you afterward and talk about your research too, because I would love to implement some of these things in more of a institutionalized way into our technology.
Yeah, and I can put you through to some of our partners on the ground. We work with, organizations that facilitate dialogue with communities in many countries. And, they'll be thrilled to work with people like you.
I always say it's just a pretty map unless we're talking to people on the ground about, what's happening with stakeholders and environmental and social concerns. So thank you very much. We'd love that.
Yeah. Thanks, Christy and Ashley, for putting us all on the call.
It's such a pleasure. And I think, like other panels today, this panel really underlies the need for work across disciplines, across stakeholder groups to address the challenges of today and move into a more sustainable future. So thank you so much for your work. Participants, I really encourage you to look up the websites of our panelists today, of Source International, Links Global Intelligence. Go to igfmining.org. And at the beginning of this panel, Isabelle referenced the IGF's annual general meeting, which is really a great space for understanding key topics across stakeholder groups and hearing from your counterparts really innovative strategies to advance sustainable development. Isabelle, do we have a date set for 2021 for the AGM?
It will all depend on COVID. Normally it's in October. We don't have a date yet because it depends on our UNCTAD partner. But the one thing I can say is that the next AGM will be a hybrid AGM where we will definitely continue with an online virtual version of it, which will allow anybody who cannot fly to the cheap city of Geneva to at least participate in the conversation. I think, yeah, that virtual platform was hard to organize, but we learned so much from how many more people we could get to the conversation just because there was no limit to the number of people who can attend. It will be in October 2021. We don't have a date yet, but so if people are interested in knowing what we do, we have a newsletter. When you connect to the website, you can join the newsletter, and at some point in time, the date will be announced.
Terrific, thank you. We're all learning together through virtual platforms and look forward to being together again in person. But thank you so much for sharing your expertise.
Thanks to all of you.